Alexander Berkman writes an essay called Invisible Revolution, where he says that all revolutions, when they begin, are never seen by the outside society. And in that essay, he talks a lot about the importance of language, that the language we use to describe our reality no longer corresponds to that reality. Gramsci mentions exactly the same thing and says that these periods when the language you use to describe your political, your economic, and social reality no longer match that reality are interregnums. They're periods of confusion. And I think that was probably where we are at this moment. We are seeing a situation where the language of opportunity provided by the capitalist system no longer corresponds to the reality that most Americans, indeed globally, most people are undergoing. That we are rapidly creating globally and domestically a kind of neo-feudalism, an oligarchic system. The language by which this corporate capitalism says that it will distribute wealth has changed from what it was in the 1950s, when we had a labor movement, and labor was never organized above 40% in this country. Now, of course, it's less than 12%. Most of them are public service workers who can't strike. The language has changed, where it's now said that when an oligarchic class amasses great sums of wealth, it trickles down and creates opportunities. That is, of course, just as much a lie as the previous system of economic distribution, and I think we still haven't yet figured out a vision, and we haven't figured out a language to describe what is happening to us in a system of global capitalism, which is different from 19th century robber baron capitalism, because global capitalism is supranational. It has no loyalty to any particular nation state. The Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Mellons, they created rapacious conditions for workers, and of course in the American labor wars were the bloodiest in the industrialized world. I mean, hundreds of workers were killed, thousands were wounded. Now we're seeing a system whereby they are hollowing the country out. Our manufacturing, of course, has gone overseas. They have created a security and surveillance apparatus because they know what's coming. They are accelerating the climate crisis and rapidly have already, of course, destroyed the working class and are rapidly destroying the middle class. And I would just end by saying that what makes some kind of revolt or revolution within the United States and probably most of the world, and historians have often written that revolutions come in waves, whether it's 1848 or 1917 or wherever. What makes it inevitable is that the system is now so completely beholden to corporate interest that in a political sense it's paralyzed. It can no longer respond to the needs of citizens. It doesn't matter what we want. It doesn't matter what we vote for. We are just day by day being further disempowered and further fleeced. And in this sense, Marx was right. Unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force that, because it has no self-imposed limits, and because it commodifies everything, human beings become commodities, the natural world becomes a commodity that exploits until exhaustion or collapse, will push and push and push until there is some kind of blowback. What it looks like, I don't know. That it's coming, I do know. And I will just close by saying that because our radical movements were destroyed after World War I in what Dwight MacDonald calls the psychosis of permanent war, it first, of course, in the name of anti-communism, now the iconography and language has changed in the name of the war on terror, we are seeing a situation where the right-wing proto-fascist movements that celebrate the gun culture, that demonize the marginalized, that's the Tea Party, that's the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party, that's the Christian right, are empowered, while those of us who care about an egalitarian populist movement have never been weaker in American history. And I think we can't discount the fact that oftentimes when there is a revolt, that revolt can be expressed through the most retrograde elements of American capitalism, which unfortunately at this moment in American history are virulent and strong, while those of us who come out of progressive and radical movements have been, are anemic and marginalized and largely shut down. You had to go back to people like Andrea Dworkin in order to get a rational critique of porn. You weren't getting it out of, and I'm not pretending in any way to be particularly well versed in the feminist movement, but I kept looking for contemporary feminists who were critiquing porn the way Dworkin did, and her book on pornography is brilliant. And in fact, when I wrote that chapter, I tried to sell it as a magazine piece to Harper's and Nation and other, and their response to me, and we're talking about, liberal, progressive, was that it was a free speech issue, and I almost fell over. The idea that a woman who is abused in a sweatshop, deserves dignity and rights, but somehow a woman who is, and let's not forget that people, and I interviewed the women who work in the industry, are physically abused. I mean, they're all taking handfuls of painkillers, they're black and blue, but somehow women who are exploited and physically abused in the sex industry, it just was mind-boggling. So I was just on the fringe of it, but I caught what you alluded to was that this redefinition of feminism, to essentially denude it of any radical critique. That's the first thing. The other thing I would just add is the way that we guard against it, and this has been my critique of the Black Bloc, and I know Derek's critique of the Black Bloc, for which we've taken some heat, is we cannot allow resistance movements to define themselves through hyper-masculinity, because essentially they import the very disease of the hyper-masculine culture they are opposed against. And that really was at the core of my critique of the Black Bloc, as I know it is at the core of Derek Jensen's critique of the Black Bloc, that these are hyper-masculine movements. And having spent 20 years of my life as a war correspondent, violence itself to hyper-masculine movements is eroticized, power is eroticized, and it's no accident that in every war that I ever covered, there is an explosion of the porn industry and sex trafficking, because what war does is it turns other human beings into objects, which is exactly what sex exploitation does to women. It turns them into objects. And that's why in all of the war zones that I was in, you saw a massive growth of sex exploitation and porn and snuff films, because essentially that's hyper-masculine culture of war becomes translated into the culture itself. So my caveat, and I think one of the reasons I've been so harsh with the Black Bloc, is because I fear that hyper-masculinity, which we cannot allow to infect movements of resistance. Otherwise, we become no different than the white male hyper-masculine power structure that we are trying to dismantle. Part of the destruction of indigenous culture by capitalism was a conscious destruction of a competing ethic. Capitalism can only define itself by what it's against, because what it is repugnant. It's about greed, profit, hoarding, exploitation, the commodification of the earth, of human beings. And indigenous societies have an ethic that is traditionally diametrically opposed to capitalism. Those who hoard and keep for themselves within an indigenous society are distrusted, if not despised. Everything is communal. Within an indigenous culture, you recognize the capacity for the sacred. Things have an intrinsic value beyond their monetary value. All of this is antithetical to capitalism, and as Marx correctly pointed out, capitalism didn't just bring with it a form of economic exploitation, but a peculiar ideology that becomes inculcated in the dominant culture. And I think part of the ruthlessness, especially in the United States, towards indigenous cultures was that they could not allow that competing ethic to exist side by side with capitalism. And so they killed it, and they put indigenous peoples in concentration camps, and that's what they were called, prisoners of war camps, before they became tribal agencies and everything else, and made them and removed their capacity for self-sustenance and self-maintenance to make them dependent on the capitalist culture which exists to this day. So I think it's important that if we're going to survive as a planet, I mean, the indigenous movements around the globe have taken the lead on this, I think not accidentally, because they have retained a residue of that way of looking and relating to the world that we must go back and recapture if we're going to survive as a species. Most revolutions are not violent. Most revolutions happen when the foot soldiers of the elite will no longer employ force to protect the elite. That was true in '79 in Iran. That was true in Petrograd when they sent the Cossacks in to quell the bread riots. They refused. They fraternized with the crowd. The Tsar was rushed back on a train and had to abdicate in a railway carriage. That was true when I covered the fall of East Germany. 70,000 people were marching in Leipzig. Honecker, who had been the dictator for 19 years, sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd. They refused. Honecker lasted another week in power. What happens, and this gets to what Berkman writes about, is that a discredited, corrupt, venal elite, which we certainly have, can no longer be protected by the internal forms of security. No revolution has ever succeeded that I know of in actually defeating an armed force, the military forces. Well, the Cuban Revolution, I mean, Castro never had much in terms of numbers in the Sierra Madre. You have to remember the Cuban Revolution was accompanied by massive strikes, protest movements, non-cooperation movements. If you can look again at the ANC, you saw a beginning with Spear of the Nation, but by the end it was non-cooperation that brought down the apartheid regime. So violence is part of revolutions. But what happens in order for a revolution to succeed is that the will to power on the part of the security agencies that protect the elite evaporates, and they are no longer willing. That is the final kind of denouement of a revolution itself, which was true even in the Russian Revolution. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer. I mean, oftentimes groups that seize power, whether it was the Bolsheviks or even in Cuba, remember, they become the dominant classes, and so they write the historical narrative. But the real revolution, which we don't understand in Russia, was an anarchist revolution. The Soviets were anarchist entities that Lenin and the Bolsheviks consciously dismantled and destroyed, and then subsequently the anarchist movement was decimated. I mean, people were executed by the Cheka. So, and for that reason, we don't even have. It's very difficult for us to have even an honest narrative of what took place in the revolution. But I would argue that most revolutions are at their core not actually violent.